Hello everyone, I am Dark Tales, and I am here to help you. Today I know you need this video for a sleep. Before that, like the video and subscribe the Dark Imagine, also where you from and what time you watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Let's start with first story. I never expected my life to turn into a waking nightmare. It started when I accepted a job as a winter caretaker for an old mountain hotel in the remote regions of Colorado. I was a struggling writer, desperate for solitude, and the promise of complete isolation for 6 months seemed perfect. I packed up my life and brought my wife, Lydia, and our 6-year-old son, Ben, along with me. It was going to be a fresh start, a chance to reconnect as a family. At least, that's what I told myself. The Black Ridge Grand Hotel stood like a forgotten relic from another time. Perched on the edge of a mountain, the hotel was beautiful in a haunting way. Massive wooden beams, red and gold carpets stretching down long, dimly lit corridors. It had once been a retreat for the wealthy, but years of financial decline had left it barely functional. The owner, a man named Mr. Delacroix, was desperate to keep it from falling into complete ruin. He hired me to maintain the boilers, clear the snow, and ensure the pipes didn't freeze over the brutal winter. Lydia was hesitant from the start. She said there was something wrong with the place. I laughed it off as nerves. It was just an old hotel, creaking with history. Besides, it was free room and board for half a year, and I could finally focus on writing. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. The snow piled up outside, sealing us into the vast, empty halls. Ben, always an intuitive child, began waking up in the middle of the night, crying. He whispered about the shadow people who stood outside his door. Lydia was convinced he was just having bad dreams, but then I started seeing things too. It began with small glimpses, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a reflection in a window that disappeared when I turned. The silence of the hotel became oppressive. I could hear footsteps in empty hallways, the sound of voices murmuring just out of reach. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. One night I was in the grand ballroom, trying to clear my head. I sat at the massive, dust-covered bar, staring at my untouched glass of whiskey. Then, out of nowhere, a voice spoke to me. "Why, don't you drink it?" I turned sharply. A man stood behind the bar, dressed in a crisp black suit, his hair slicked back. I hadn't heard anyone enter. Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled. "Just a friend." I blinked, and he was gone. The glass was empty. After that, the hotel came alive. The painting seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Lydia became withdrawn, avoiding certain hallways as if she knew something was watching. Ben refused to go near the basement, screaming whenever I carried him past the stairwell. I found old records in the storage room. The Black Ridge had a dark history. Murders, disappearances, and a family who had stayed one winter in the 1920s, only for the father to go mad and butcher his wife and children. The papers said he claimed the hotel whispered to him, that it told him they had to die. I stopped sleeping. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, flickering in and out of existence. The hotel pulsed like a living thing, breathing around me. The voice returned, whispering sweet reassurances in my ear. "They don't trust you. You see how they look at you. I think you're losing your mind. I'll leave you, just like before." I tried to ignore it, but Lydia started watching me differently, like she was afraid, and maybe she should have been. The more I listened, the more it made sense. They didn't understand. I was the only one who truly saw the hotel for what it was. It had chosen me. The night it all came to a head, a storm raged outside, howling against the walls. The power flickered. I woke to find the room empty. Lydia and Ben were gone. I stumbled into the hallway, my breath fogging in the cold air. "Lydia!" No answer. Then I heard Ben crying from somewhere below, the basement. I descended the stairs, my heart hammering. The darkness was thick, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. A single light bulb flickered above as I stepped inside. Lydia stood in the center of the room, clutching Ben to her chest. Her eyes were wide, wild with fear. "Stay back," she whispered. I stopped. "Lydia, what are you doing?" She shook her head. "It's not you anymore." I didn't understand. I wanted to, but then I saw the knife in my hand. I didn't remember picking it up. Something inside me cracked. My mind flooded with images. Blood on the walls, Lydia screaming, Ben's lifeless body crumpled at my feet. But I hadn't done it, not yet. I dropped the knife. The whispers screamed in my ears, furious. Lydia yanked Ben away, running for the stairs. I followed, but my legs felt sluggish, as if something were trying to hold me back. She made it outside. The snow swallowed them whole, vanishing into the night. The hotel groaned around me, angry. I sat there, alone, listening to the whispers grow fainter. The Black Ridge had failed. It hadn't won me after all. The police found me days later, half frozen in the grand ballroom, muttering to myself. They searched the mountain for Lydia and Ben, but they never found them. The snow had taken them, the same way the hotel had taken everything else. They put me in a hospital, told me I was delusional, that I had hurt my family. But I know the truth. The Black Ridge Grand Hotel is alive, and it's still waiting for me to come home. Let's dive second story. I never believed in the old superstitions. My name is Adrian Petrescu, and I was raised in the heart of Romania, where ancient tales of creatures lurking in the shadows were whispered from generation to generation. But I was a man of reason, a journalist who chased truth, not fairy tales. I should have listened. It began when I was assigned to investigate a series of unexplained deaths in a remote village in the Carpathian Mountains. Locals spoke in hushed voices about a dark figure seen near the graves at night. They called him Strigoi, a cursed soul returned from the dead to feed on the living. It was nonsense, I told myself, the product of fearful minds clinging to folklore. I arrived in the village of Briaza, just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks. The houses were modest, their wooden frames leaning with age, and the streets were empty. An old woman named Ioana agreed to let me stay in her home. She warned me not to go out after dark. "The night does not belong to us," she said, gripping my arm with a strength that surprised me. "They smell the blood, the warmth of the living." That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, carried by the wind, then a scratching at the window. My heart pounded as I forced myself to look. A shadow stood beyond the glass, tall and motionless, its face obscured. The candle beside me flickered violently, and in that brief, dying glow, I saw them. Eyes like burning embers. I stumbled backward, knocking over the table, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. The next morning I found fresh graves disturbed, the soil clawed away as if something had forced its way out. The bodies inside were pale, their expressions frozen in terror. Ioana refused to speak of it, crossing herself whenever I mentioned what I had seen. The villagers were leaving, one by one, abandoning their homes, but I stayed. I had to know. That evening I ventured into the ruins of an old chapel, said to be built over the resting place of something not meant to wake. The air was thick with decay. A stairway led down into a crypt, and as I descended, the candle in my hand wavered. At the bottom, there were coffins, their lids slightly ajar. A whisper came from within one of them. My fingers trembled as I reached for the lid. It burst open. A hand shot out, pale as death, gripping my wrist with inhuman strength. A man sat up, his face hollow and ancient, his lips stained crimson. His eyes met mine, and I felt my mind unravel. "You should not have come," he whispered, his voice like rustling leaves. I fought against his grip, breaking free, stumbling back into the darkness. He did not follow. He didn't need to. I ran through the village, my breath ragged, but the doors were bolted shut. Ayana was gone. Everyone was gone. I reached her home and locked myself inside, praying for the sunrise. But when the first light touched the mountains, I saw the truth. My reflection in the mirror was fading. My breath no longer fogged the glass. My veins burned with hunger. I had not escaped. I had been chosen. The villagers knew, that is why they had left. The curse had not been broken. It had simply found a new host. Now, I sit in the dark, waiting for nightfall, listening to the whispers outside my window. They call to me, and I am afraid of the moment when I will finally answer. Let's dive third story. I never thought I would witness true evil. My name is Father Manuel Ortega, and for 30 years I served as a priest in a small town nestled in the mountains of Mexico. I had seen suffering, desperation, and even death, but nothing prepared me for what happened to the girl named Valeria. She was 12 when her mother, Sofia, came to the church begging for help. I had known the family all my life. Valeria had been a bright, joyful child, always running barefoot through the village, her laughter echoing in the cobblestone streets. But when Sofia entered my chapel that evening, her face was drained of hope, her eyes hollow with fear. "She's not my daughter anymore, Padre," she whispered, clutching my hands. "Something is inside her." I hesitated, believing it to be an illness, a trauma, something that could be healed with care and time. But when I visited their home, my faith was shaken. The house was dark, the air thick with the stench of rotting meat. The moment I stepped inside, I heard it, a growl, deep and unnatural, coming from Valeria's room. She sat in the corner, her body frail, her skin sickly pale. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her lips were cracked. But it was her eyes that filled me with dread. They were black, devoid of light, staring straight through me as if I were nothing more than a shadow. "Hola, Padre," she said, her voice twisted, guttural, mocking. "Have you come to pray for me?" Sophia gasped and crossed herself. I stepped closer, gripping my rosary, but the air turned ice-cold. Valeria's lips curled into a smile that did not belong on the face of a child. "She isn't sick," I murmured. "Something else is here." I sought help from the church in Mexico City. They were reluctant, as exorcisms were rare and dangerous. But after hearing Sophia's testimony, the voices, the objects moving on their own, the scratches appearing on Valeria's body overnight, they granted me permission to perform the ritual. The night of the exorcism, the house trembled as if the very walls recoiled from what was inside. I stood before Valeria, the sacred text in my trembling hands, and began to pray. She laughed, a sound that no human throat should be able to produce. The room reeked of sulfur. "You can't save her," the voice hissed from her mouth. "She belongs to me." Her body convulsed violently, her limbs bending at unnatural angles. I called upon the Lord's name, splashing holy water upon her, but she shrieked as the liquid burned her flesh. The windows shattered, a wind howled through the house, and in the chaos I saw it. Her shadow twisting on the wall, changing shape, elongating into something monstrous. She lunged at me, her small hands wrapping around my throat with inhuman strength. I choked out a prayer, and suddenly she screamed in agony, her body thrashing, the demon fighting to remain. With one final cry, she collapsed, her breathing shallow, her eyes fluttering shut. It was over, or so I thought. The village rejoiced, praising the Lord for the miracle, and for a time all seemed well. But Sophia, her face still etched with fear, confided in me. Valeria was different now, quiet, distant. She did not laugh anymore. One evening, as I walked past their home, I saw her standing in the doorway, staring at me with an expression I could not place. A chill ran through me. "Thank you, Padre," she said, her voice gentle but wrong. Then she smiled, and in that smile I saw it. The same twisted curl of the lips, the same dark emptiness in her eyes. It had never left. The exorcism had not saved her, it had simply let it wear her better. Let's dive fourth story. My name is Emilio Reyes, and I do not expect anyone to believe what I am about to recount. I was once a professor of anthropology at the University of Buenos Aires, dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of ancient civilizations. But what I discovered in my final expedition has shattered my mind, leaving me haunted by whispers in the dark, by the weight of truths not meant for human understanding. It began with a letter, written in desperate, uneven script by my former mentor, Dr. Luis Montoya. He had vanished months earlier while researching pre-Columbian artifacts along the desolate coast of Patagonia, where whispers of forgotten gods still lingered among the Mapuche people. His letter was brief, nearly incoherent, but it spoke of something buried beneath the waves, something that should never have been uncovered. He urged me to come quickly, to see for myself before they came for him. By the time I arrived in Puerto San Julian, Montoya was already gone. His small rented home had been ransacked, books torn from shelves, pages scattered across the floor. There were symbols, grotesque spirals and angular shapes carved into the wooden walls. The police dismissed it as the work of thieves, but I knew better. I found his journal beneath the overturned bed, its final entries barely legible, filled with manic scrawls of coastal ruins, drowned gods, and the unblinking gaze of something watching from beneath the sea. I traced his last known journey to an abandoned fishing village farther down the coast. The locals refused to speak of it, crossing themselves at the mere mention of its name. Bahia Negra. It was a place forsaken, they said, swallowed by the ocean long ago. The few who dared fish near its waters spoke of shadows beneath the waves, of guttural voices carried by the wind. But I was a man of science, bound by reason, and so I set out alone. The village was worse than I imagined. Half-buried shacks slumped under the weight of time, their doors hanging open like silent screams. The sand was littered with remnants of crude idols, eroded by the tide. The air was thick with the stench of salt and decay. I found Montoya's campsite near the cliffs. His notes, damp and crumbling, spoke of an ancient stone altar, recently unearthed by a storm. He had believed it predated all known civilizations in the region, possibly connected to the legends of the Deep Ones, a race of beings that dwelt beneath the ocean. He had mentioned a cave, revealed by the shifting tides, where he had heard something. The cave yawned before me like the mouth of a beast. I hesitated only a moment before descending, my lantern casting feeble light upon the slick, glistening walls. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the formations became. The carvings were neither Incan nor Mapuche. No, they belonged to something far older, something alien. Then I saw it, the altar, and the thing upon it. It was not human. The body, if it could be called that, was bloated and grey, its flesh webbed and pulsing. Its eyes were lidless, black as the abyss, and though its mouth was twisted into a permanent grimace, I knew that it was aware of me. The whispers began, not with sound, but within my skull. A voice vast and fathomless, older than the earth itself. It spoke of dreams and madness, of the deep that would rise once more. My knees buckled as visions flooded my mind. Colossal cities beneath the sea, towers of impossible geometry, and something stirring in the darkness, its slumbering form shifting with the tide. I do not remember fleeing, only that I awoke on the shore, the tide lapping at my trembling hands. The cave was gone, swallowed by the returning waves. But I knew the truth now. Montoya had not disappeared. He had been taken. I left Patagonia that night, but the dreams followed. I see it when I close my eyes. The monolithic ruins, the endless abyss, the black eyes that stare from beneath the tide. I hear the whispers growing louder with each passing night. I was a man of reason. Now I am but a shell, waiting. For I know that one day soon the tide will rise again, and when it does, we will all drown in the depths of something far older and far more hungry than we could ever comprehend. Let's dive. Fifth story. My name is Javier Salgado, and I know now that some things should never be disturbed. I once believed that death was the end, but I have seen otherwise. And for what I did, I am paying the price every single day. It started when my wife, Lucia, and I moved to a small village in Argentina's northwest, near the foothills of the Andes. We had just lost our son, Mateo, to a sudden illness, and the grief had hollowed us out. We wanted to escape, to find solace in a quieter place where the past could not follow. But grief is not something you can outrun. The villagers were kind but wary. They welcomed us with cautious smiles, their eyes always shadowed with unspoken warnings. There was something ancient about this place, something that sat just beneath the surface of the everyday. But I ignored the tension in the air, believing it was nothing more than small-town superstition. We settled into an old house at the edge of town, near a dense patch of forest that the locals called El Bosque de los Muertos, the forest of the dead. They warned us never to enter, especially at night. They told us it was sacred ground, a place where spirits lingered. But warnings are easy to dismiss when you are blinded by sorrow. It was our neighbor, old Don Ernesto, who first told me about the burial ground. He spoke in hushed tones, his wrinkled hands trembling as he traced strange symbols in the dirt. He said that deep within the forest, past the worn-out graves and crumbling stones, there was a place older than the village itself, a place where the dead did not stay dead. I should have walked away. I should have never listened. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I found myself standing at Mateo's grave. The weight of my loss bore down on me, suffocating, unbearable. The wind carried whispers, voices that were not there, and then a thought came to me. Mad, desperate, but irresistible. That night, with a shovel in my hands and desperation in my heart, I carried my son's lifeless body through the darkened woods. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, thick with something unseen. I reached the burial ground, a clearing ringed with ancient stones, their surfaces etched with carvings too worn to decipher. I buried him there, under the cold moonlight, whispering his name as if it would anchor him to this world. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment I thought I heard laughter. Low, guttural, inhuman. But I told myself it was just the night playing tricks on me. I should have known that nothing comes back the same. 3 days later, Mateo returned. I woke to the sound of small footsteps padding across the wooden floor, to the creak of his bedroom door opening. My heart pounded as I turned on the light, and there he stood. But it was not my son. His eyes were too dark, too hollow, like twin voids that swallowed all light. His face was pale, stretched too tight over his small bones. He did not speak. He only watched me, head tilted slightly, as if struggling to remember how to be human. Lucia wept with joy, blind to what I could see, but as the days passed she began to notice. Matteo never blinked. He did not sleep, he did not eat, and the house, once filled with sorrow, became filled with something worse, an oppressive, crawling dread that settled into our bones. Then the animals started to die. First, the neighbor's dog, its body found twisted, its mouth frozen in an eternal scream. Then the birds, falling lifeless from the sky, their beady eyes pecked out. The villagers began to whisper, crossing themselves when they saw a home. Lucia finally saw the truth when she caught him standing over our bed in the dead of night, his small fingers clutching a kitchen knife. She screamed, and for the first time since he returned, Matteo smiled. I knew then what had to be done. The burial ground had given me back something, but it had taken my son in return. What stood in our home was not Matteo. It was something else, something that should have stayed buried. I carried him back to the forest, his lifeless stare unblinking as I whispered apologies. I buried him again, deeper this time, covering the grave with stones, with prayers, with everything I had left to give. As I turned to leave, I heard his voice, not from the grave, but behind me, close to my ear. "Papa!" I ran. I never looked back. We left the village the next day. But even now, in the quiet moments before sleep takes me, I hear him. In the wind, in the shadows, waiting. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some graves should never be disturbed. And some things, once brought back, never truly leave. Let's dive sixth story. My name is Alejandro Rojas, and I have spent the last year trying to convince myself that what happened at Casa Monteverde was nothing more than a dream, a trick of the mind. But the truth is, I have never been more awake. It was supposed to be a simple project. A historical assessment of an old hacienda on the outskirts of San Miguel de Allende, a colonial relic that had stood for over 2 centuries. The owners, distant relatives of the original aristocratic family, wanted to restore it and transform it into a luxury hotel. My job as an architectural historian was to document its structure, assess its viability, and research its past. A routine job. I had done dozens before, but Casa Monteverde was different. From the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The air hung thick with the scent of damp wood, and something sweet, like decaying flowers. The courtyard, though grand, was strangely silent, as if the very earth had swallowed all sound, and the house itself, its towering adobe walls, its wrought iron balconies, seemed to watch me, waiting. The caretaker, Senora Valeria, was an old woman with deep-set eyes and a voice like dried leaves. She refused to stay after sundown, locking the gates promptly at 6, muttering something about la casa que despierta de noche. The house that wakes at night. I laughed it off. Superstition was common in these parts, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt something shift, as if the house took a slow, deep breath. That first night, I slept in one of the upstairs bedrooms, a grand space with high ceilings and an ornate bed draped in moth-eaten lace. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the faint echo of voices. I chalked it up to exhaustion, the weight of travel pressing down on me, but then the knocking started. Soft at first, a single tap against the wooden floor, then another, and another, a rhythmic pattern that grew louder, closer. I lit a candle and stepped into the hallway, expecting to find a loose shutter or some rodent scurrying in the darkness. Instead, I saw footprints, wet, muddy prints leading from my door down the long corridor. I followed them, slowly, my breath tight in my chest. They ended at a door I had not yet opened. The handle was ice cold, my hand shook as I turned it. The room beyond was untouched, draped in dust and time. A grand mirror stood against the far wall, its surface dulled with age, but as I stepped closer, my reflection did not move. It stood there, staring back, smiling. I ran. I locked the bedroom door behind me and did not sleep until dawn. The next day, I tried to focus on my work, convincing myself that it had been a dream. But the house did not let me forget. Objects moved from where I had left them. Whispers curled through the air like smoke, calling my name. And the mirror, it no longer reflected me at all. I went into town, desperate for answers. The locals averted their eyes when I mentioned the house. Only one man, an old librarian, dared to speak. He told me of the family that once lived there, of the wife, Beatrice Monteverde, who was said to have gone mad after losing her child, how she had wandered the halls at night calling for her son, scratching at the walls until her fingers bled, how one morning she was found hanging from the great chandelier in the dining hall, her body swaying as if caught in a slow dance with the wind. They said she never left. I should have left that night. But something held me there, an invisible tether, a whisper in my ear telling me I was meant to stay. That night, I awoke to the feeling of fingers brushing against my cheek. I opened my eyes and she was there, Beatrice, or what remained of her. Her face was pale, stretched too tight over her bones, her mouth a gaping wound of sorrow. Her fingers, long and broken, reached for me, her voice a wet whisper. Mijo, mijo. I could not move. The weight of centuries pressed down on me, suffocating, drowning, and then, just as suddenly, she was gone. I fled at first light, abandoning my work, my belongings, everything. But Casa Monteverde did not let me go so easily. The whispers followed me, creeping into my dreams, into the spaces between shadows. I see her reflection in mirrors that are not mine. I hear her voice in the silence of the night. And sometimes, just before I wake, I feel those fingers on my cheek, gently, as if reminding me that I will never truly leave. Because some houses do not forget. Some houses do not forgive, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Let's dive 7H story. I never should have gone back. I tell myself this every night when I wake up, drenched in sweat, staring at the darkened corners of my bedroom, half expecting them to stretch and swallow me whole. I knew what the house was, or at least I thought I did, and yet something called me back. The house belonged to my uncle, Ramon Velasquez, a reclusive professor of Latin American folklore. It sat at the edge of the city, tucked between modern developments that seemed to encroach upon it like an unwanted relic of the past. When he died, I was the only one left to deal with his estate. I hadn't seen him in years, not since I was a child, but I remembered his obsession with the house. He claimed it was older than the city itself, that its foundations were deeper than they had any right to be, but that it changed. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sky bruised with the coming storm. The house stood silent, its faded stucco walls cracked like old parchment. The key turned too easily in the lock. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old books and something else. Something damp, metallic. The wooden floor groaned beneath my feet, but the house was empty. At least, I thought it was. The first few days were uneventful. I sorted through my uncle's papers, his endless notes about the house, about how doorways seemed to appear and disappear, how rooms were sometimes larger on the inside than they should have been. I dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man slowly losing his mind. Until the night I heard footsteps where there should have been none. It started at exactly 3:12 a.m. Slow, deliberate steps moving just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear, then silence. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that old houses creak and shift. But when I stepped into the hallway, my stomach clenched. The corridor stretched farther than I remembered. It was subtle at first, an extra foot of space, a wall that didn't quite align with my memory. But each night, the house changed. Doors led to places they shouldn't. Hallways twisted impossibly long. I placed a chair in front of one door, a test to see if the house was playing tricks on me. The next morning, the chair was gone, the door leading somewhere entirely new. I called an old friend, Santiago, someone who didn't laugh at ghost stories. He arrived skeptical, but as we explored the house, he saw it too. The shifting walls, the vanishing thresholds. We mapped the house, marking doorways with chalk, measuring the rooms. Nothing made sense. The house was wrong, bigger, and something was inside it with us. One night, the knocking started. At first, just soft taps from deep within the walls, then louder, more insistent. Santiago and I followed the sound, through corridors that should not exist, down a spiral staircase we were certain wasn't there before. The air grew thick, pressing against us like unseen hands. We reached a door, an old wooden thing covered in deep gouges, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. My uncle had written about this door. "Do not open it," he had warned in his notes. "No matter what you hear." Something moved behind it. The knocking became frantic, desperate, and then a voice. "Ayúdame!" I stepped back, my heart hammering. Santiago whispered, "That sounded like your uncle." He was right. The voice was weak, choked with panic, but it was him, my uncle who had been dead for months. Santiago reached for the handle and I grabbed his arm. I don't know why. Maybe instinct, maybe terror. But we ran. The house fought us, twisting, stretching, pulling us deeper into its impossible geometry. The walls closed in, the air thick with whispers. My uncle's voice followed, growing fainter, more desperate. We barely escaped, tumbling out onto the front steps as the door behind us slammed shut on its own. We never spoke of it again. I sold the house, left the city, tried to move on. But the nightmares persist. The feeling of something watching me, waiting. And sometimes, just before dawn, I hear the knocking, soft at first, then louder, and then a voice. My uncle's voice, begging me to let him out. Let's dive 8th story. I never wanted to be a part of this. I told myself that over and over. But when you're staring into the abyss, sometimes it stares right back. My name is Anna, and I used to be a forensic psychologist for the federal police. Used to be. Because some doors once opened can never be closed again. It began with the case of Julio El Brujo Mendez, a serial murderer who terrorized northern Mexico for over a decade. His victims were always found mutilated in a specific way, clean, ritualistic, as if he was performing some kind of ancient rite. The press called him El Brujo, the warlock, because of the strange symbols carved into the flesh of his victims. Some believed he was tapping into something older, darker than we understood. When they finally caught him, he didn't resist. He sat in his dilapidated shack, surrounded by flickering candles and bones, smiling like he had been expecting them. He was taken to a high-security facility outside Monterrey, where I was assigned to evaluate him. My job was to understand the mind of a monster. What I didn't realize was that he would understand me first. The first time I met him, he was calm, polite even. He addressed me by my full name before I had introduced myself. His voice was deep, deliberate, as if every word was chosen with care. He asked about my family, about my dreams, about the things that kept me awake at night. He laughed when I refused to answer. "You will tell me," he said. "We always talk to the ones who listen." Over the next few weeks, I studied him. He had the intelligence of a scholar, the patience of a hunter. He described his killings with no remorse, no hesitation. To him, they were necessary sacrifices, offerings to something that whispered to him in the dark. He would smile as he spoke, eyes gleaming as if recalling some private joke. I told myself I was in control, that I was only observing, but something in his words gnawed at me. Then came the letters. He would slide them across the table during our sessions, old parchment written in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. At first I dismissed them as nonsense, but when I had them translated, my blood ran cold. They were invocations, calls to something he referred to as La Madre del Silencio, the Mother of Silence. I dreamt of her that night, a tall, shadowed figure, her face hidden behind a veil. She stood at the foot of my bed, whispering in a voice like wind through dead trees. When I woke, my room was freezing, and the taste of earth and blood lingered in my mouth. Julio knew. The next day he only smiled. "She heard you," he said. "She is listening now." The murders didn't stop after Julio's arrest. They continued, identical in method, as if he had never been caught. The police were baffled. How could a man locked away in solitary confinement still be orchestrating death? I confronted him, my voice shaking. His laughter filled the cell, echoing off the concrete walls. "You think it was only me?" he whispered. "You think I was alone?" That night, my mother called me. She swore she saw something outside her house, standing beneath the streetlight. A woman, tall and motionless, her face obscured by a veil. When she blinked, the figure was gone. My mother is not a woman easily shaken, but her voice trembled as she told me to be careful. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I found a new letter on my desk. I never brought it in. It wasn't from Julio. The paper was yellowed, brittle, the words written in dark red ink. "You have been chosen to listen." I resigned the next day. Left the city, but no matter where I go, I hear her voice in the silence. When the wind moves through the trees, when the night grows too still, when my own breath catches in my throat, she is there, listening, waiting, and one day I will answer.